Janine Austin is founder of the world's first specialist psychiatric genetic counseling clinic in Vancouver, Canada. This clinic recently won an award for its impacts on patient outcomes. Janine has worked in the area of psychiatric genetic counseling for almost 15 years and is the past chair of NSGC's Psychiatric Special Interest Group. She co-authored a book for healthcare professionals about psychiatric genetic counseling and has published more than 60 scientific papers in this area. Janine has won national and international awards for her leadership in this area and was the 2016 president of the National Society of Genetic Counselors. Janine is an associate professor at the University of British Columbia, is executive director of the BC Mental Health and Addictions Research Institute. She also has her own experiences with depression and anxiety. With those remarks said, I am thrilled and honored to turn our presentation over to Janine Austin. Hi, Janine.
Hello, Catherine. Thank you very much for the lovely introduction, and welcome everybody to tonight's webinar. I'm really glad that you could be here. So I thought that the way that we might start out this evening is by thinking about some of the really common questions that people have when mental illness is something in the family. So basically, lots of people end up wondering things like, what does cause mental illness? What about genetic testing? Is there a genetic test that I could have for depression or schizophrenia or bipolar, OCD, these kinds of things? What does my family history of mental illness mean for me or for my kids? And then is there anything that we might be able to do to protect our mental health? So I do want to sort of make explicit, just as we get started chatting together, that it can be really frightening actually to ask these kinds of questions. So if you are asking these questions, yay you, it's super brave, good job. Seriously. And I hope that some of the answers that I have for you this evening might be more reassuring than perhaps you might be expecting. So if you are asking any of these questions or anything related to these questions, you're in the right place, because these are the things that we will be talking about together this evening. So as human beings, I think this is a good place to start. As human beings, when things happen to us in our lives, we tend to need explanations as to why the things happen, particularly if they're bad things. And often when mental illness arises in a family, we perceive that to be a bad thing. And so because we need to understand why things happen, if we're not presented with a coherent explanation as to why, we create our own explanations. And the unfortunate thing is that sometimes the explanations about why mental illness happened that we create for ourselves makes us feel guilty or ashamed or fearful or stigmatized, all sorts of things like that. So just a couple of examples of things that people often wonder about when it comes to causes of mental illness. So, you know, this is a quote from somebody that I've interacted with who lives with mental illness themselves. And they're saying, there's always just this thought that maybe you're just a bad person, that maybe you're just lazy. So that's this idea that there's some kind of moral failing or something associated with having a mental illness. You know, I speak to lots of people who worry that is it my fault that I have schizophrenia, let's say, because I smoked too much pot when I was a young person? So these kinds of things are really common for us to worry about. And then, you know, at the other end of the spectrum, I've also spoken to lots of people over the years who've just said to me things like, well, I'm always going to be like this. I was born with it. It's just how it is. So just to give you a spoiler, if you're feeling either one of these two ways, it's not your fault. Mental illness is not your fault. And you don't have to be necessarily stuck in a bad place. That's the spoiler alert. But please do stick around, because I hope to be able to help you understand why I can say these things with authority, to convince you of the truth of what I'm saying, basically. Okay. So the thing with mental illness and our explanations for cause, though, is that it's not just people who live with mental illness themselves that ask questions about why did this happen. I'm anticipating that probably in the audience tonight, there's probably some family members too. And amongst family members of people with mental illness, explanations for cause of illness are also very, very important. So I have a couple of quotes to share with you about that. This is one from a mother of a child with Asperger's syndrome. So she says, "The feeling that we somehow caused this is strong. This happens because we're judged harshly due to our child's behaviours. I was lectured by family members about our parenting skills." So this mum is talking about how she's internalized this idea that her child has the problems that they do because she's a bad parent in some way. So, often when I speak to relatives of people with mental illness, they typically talk about how great it would be if there was a genetic explanation for the causes of these conditions, because we tend to feel that it would help people to blame us less. So you might expect that having a genetic explanation for cause of a mental illness would be a good thing. Not necessarily. I've got a quote with you to share about that. So this is a quote from a father of a child with bipolar disorder, and he says, "It came from my side. I've got the guilt. If I hadn't had him, he wouldn't be like that. If I'd known more at the time, I probably wouldn't have had any children because of what I've seen happen to him. I didn't think about this being passed on when I was 23 years old. You think, this will never happen to me." So the deal for this father was that his son developed bipolar disorder, and as soon as it emerged in his son, he had that awful sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach that was like, oh, this is what my Aunt Rose had. So he started feeling guilty about the idea that he passed on quote unquote bad genes, and that was why his son was sick. So anyway, my mission this evening is that by the end of this presentation, if you're feeling guilty or ashamed or worried about the causes of mental illness in any way, I hope that what I have to share with you makes those feelings decrease, and hopefully that you feel that you might want to talk with a genetic counsellor in a one-on-one kind of setting to get even more insight about how things might be playing out in your unique family situation. Okay, so that's my goal for this evening. That's my order to myself. So maybe we should back up a little bit and talk about what exactly it is that we're discussing. What is mental illness? I mean, I'm anticipating that you're going to be very familiar with this, most of my audience this evening, but just to frame it for you a little bit, I suppose, mental illness is a super common. So 1 in every 4 people will experience mental illness in their lifetime, and I have no problems at all telling you I'm one of them. I've had a bunch of experiences with depression, and I also experience anxiety as well. So these are really common conditions. We may not feel always that they're that common because we don't talk about them as much as we should, but they are very, very common conditions. And so when I'm talking about mental illnesses this evening, I'm specifically thinking about things like schizophrenia, bipolar, depression, anxiety, OCD, all of these kinds of things that tend to emerge during adolescence, eating disorders, ADHD, all of these kinds of things. Things that tend to emerge during adolescence or early adulthood is really where my focus is going to be. And so in terms of what we, understanding cause, well then people have been asking questions about what causes mental illness for decades upon decades, possibly even centuries, actually. And so the way that we're used to thinking about this question is often in terms of things like, is it nature or nurture? Is it a chemical imbalance in the brain? And I hope to be able to talk to you a little bit later about why I don't like the dichotomy of nature or nurture. But maybe I shouldn't get ahead of myself. We'll get there in a minute. But so let's talk about what we do from a researcher's perspective if we want to understand what causes an illness like mental illness. So basically, this is what we do. We ask a set of questions that doesn't vary. It helps you understand what causes any condition you might be interested in. But we've applied these questions in the context of mental illness. So the first question we tend to ask is, first, does the condition that we're talking about run in families? If it does, then we can start asking questions about, okay, then, well, how much does genetics contribute in this particular context? And if genetics contributes, then the next obvious question is, well, what then are the genetic factors that are involved? And once you've got that nailed down, then you can start asking questions about how do these genetic factors contribute to whether or not somebody develops a mental illness. So I'm going to take you through what we've done from a research perspective to address these questions, just to sort of start us all out in the same place. And then I'm going to talk about how it might relate to you and your family situation. Okay, so first of all, let's deal with the question of, does mental illness run in families? And so what you're looking at here is a table that shows what the chances for somebody in the general population to develop a psychiatric illness like schizophrenia or bipolar, for example. And then in that column on the right-hand side, it shows what the chances for somebody who has a close family member with one of these conditions to develop the condition too. And so what you can see in every single line here is that the chance for relatives is much higher than, well, is higher, I should say, than the chance for people who in the general population to develop one of these conditions. So what I don't want you to think, if you're looking at this table, if you're looking at this and freaking out and thinking, oh my goodness, this seems very high, is that what my chance is? Actually, we can't use these numbers to tell an individual exactly what their chance might be, because there's all sorts of things, unique factors in your history that are going to modify that number. And so if this is something that's of concern to you, then I would strongly suggest that having a chat with a genetic counsellor might be a really good thing to do. And we can talk about how you can do that at the end. But so the thing that I want you to take away from this slide is simply that what we know from research is that the chance for developing mental illness is higher if you have a close blood relative than if you don't, essentially. And you might think, well, that obviously tells us that genetics is important in contributing to the development of these conditions. Well, actually, it doesn't, because you could imagine a situation where perhaps there's a higher chance in the family because the family shares an environment in some way that makes them more vulnerable to developing mental illness. So really, actually, this question, does mental illness run in families, doesn't help us really untangle whether it's genes or environment or nature or nurture, if you like, that contributes to the development of these conditions. To answer that question, we need to ask a different question, which is this one, really. How much does genetics contribute? And so to answer this question, researchers have used the concept of twin studies. And don't worry about this table, I'm going to walk you through it. So twin studies are a really great way to figure out how much genes and environment each contribute to a given condition. The idea really is that identical twins come from the same sperm and the same egg. And so we can think of them as having the same genetic information, whereas non-identical twins share on average about half of their genetic information, the same as a regular brother or sister would. And so we can compare the concordance rate, and that's literally just the rate with which a co-twin has a condition if their other twin is affected. We can compare that rate between identical and non-identical twins. And if a condition is entirely caused by genes, we would expect that if one of a pair of identical twins has the condition, then their co-twin is going to have the same condition 100% of the time. So if you look at that middle column in this table here, the first thing I want you to notice is that none of these numbers is 100%. Okay, so that tells us a really profound thing really straight away. It tells us that these conditions are not caused entirely by genes. Okay, but what geneticists do, what we look for is, if this number is always higher than this number, then that tells us that genetics must be playing a role, basically. So that's what we can tell by looking at this table. First thing, these are not conditions that are caused entirely by genes. Second thing, that genetics seems to be playing a role. Okay, and so yeah, these are some important things, I think. So just to reiterate, so these twin studies can tell us that it's not nature or nurture. Both of these kinds of concepts are important. And I'm just going to take a minute to tell you why I don't like the dichotomy of nature or nurture. So to me, nature suggests, that it's just inborn and it's done and you're stuck with it. And as we're going to see, that's not the case with these conditions. And then nurture to me suggests, just to put it bluntly, it suggests that we might be blaming parents, essentially. Like, about it's how we nurture our children that determines whether or not they develop a mental illness. So I don't really like those terms very much. So you'll catch me this evening talking about genes and environment, because I feel that fits much better in terms of the concepts that we're talking about. So both genes and our environment, or our experiences, if you like, both of these things are important in whether or not we develop a mental illness. So as you've heard me say, but it's so important, I'm going to say it one more time. Mental illness is not caused entirely by genes or by our experiences. Both of these things are important. This is an interesting point that really matters to some families. That what we can tell from looking at this stuff is that we don't inherit mental illness itself. Okay, but what we can inherit is a vulnerability to mental illness, and that's a slightly different thing, but it's powerful in terms of its consequences, and we'll look at that in a bit. The other thing that we can tell from looking at these numbers is that there's no genetic test that's going to be able to tell us with absolute certainty who will and who will not develop a mental illness, because there's this really important role for our experiences in determining whether or not this is something that happens to us, essentially. Okay, all right. So in terms of our sequence of questions, we're at this one right now. Okay, so we've established that yes, mental illnesses do run in families. We've established that genetics does contribute. It's not the only thing, but it contributes. But now we can start thinking about what the particular genetic factors that are involved might be. And in order to answer this question, I'm going to do some genetics 101. I'm going to try and make it fun, I promise. And I won't get too scary with it if I can. But we're going to start at the beginning. And I know some of you probably have all sorts of training in genetics. To you, I apologize sincerely. But I think it's really important for those of us that may not have had, that kind of background, that we all get to a place where we feel somewhat comfortable with the concepts. So I'm just going to take a couple of minutes to talk about that. So your body, all of our bodies are made up of cells. Each one is too tiny to see with your naked eye. You need microscopes to look at your cells. And your DNA is found inside the structure within the cell called the nucleus. So we're talking tiny, tiny, tiny right here. But despite that, this boggles my mind every time I think about it. The DNA in each one of your cells is about 2 meters long. But it's so tiny that you can't see it, and anyway. So the point is that there's a lot of this genetic material, this DNA, that has to fit in every one of these tiny microscopic cells, and so it's very, very thin, and it's coiled, like tightly packed into structures called chromosomes. So that's really what chromosomes are: is these tightly packed coils of DNA that allow it to squish into the tiny package called the nucleus inside the cell. And so we don't have a single big long strand of DNA in each one of our cells. Most of our cells actually have 46 of these tiny, tightly packed packages of DNA called chromosomes. And some bits of the chromosomes, some bits of the DNA are special. They're the bits of the DNA that we call genes, and they're the bits that tell our bodies how to make proteins. And proteins are the building blocks that make our cells. So we've come back full circle, kind of thing, to the concept of the cell. So our cells are made up of proteins, which our body makes according to the instructions that are in our genes, which is inside the cell. Kind of an exciting and convoluted process, but yeah. So if we want to answer the question of what are the genetic factors that are involved in psychiatric disorders, we can look for those answers at the level of chromosomes, or we can look for them at the level of genes and the DNA sequence itself. And actually, both have been done. I'm going to tell you a little bit about both strategies. Okay, so when you actually take chromosomes and look down a microscope at them, this is what they look like. These are the 46 packages that we were talking about. And so this is actually what a man's set of chromosomes would look like. And the only difference between a man's set of chromosomes and a woman's is really this pair at the end. So a man will have an X and a Y, and a woman, at least biologically, will have 2 X chromosomes. And so in the beginning, when we started asking questions about what are the genetic factors that contribute to the development of psychiatric illness, the only thing that we had the capacity to do technically was to look down microscopes at our chromosomes. So we did that with people with psychiatric disorders, and there's absolutely no difference between what the chromosomes look like for somebody who has a schizophrenia, let's say, and what the chromosomes look like for somebody that does not have schizophrenia. So importantly, sometimes for some conditions, chromosomes do look different. So we know, for example, that Down syndrome, which is a really common genetic syndrome that you might have seen or heard about in the news, that's caused by having an extra copy of chromosome number 21 here. But as I said, with psychiatric disorders, there's nothing that we can see that's different between people who have a psychiatric disorder and those who don't. So really, it took some more time and being able to look at the DNA in much closer detail in order to sort of figure out some of these questions. What are the genetic factors that contribute to the development of these conditions? Essentially, the differences are too small to be seen by looking at a chromosome down a microscope. But we have done a bunch of work, and what we know is that there are different types of genetic variation that can contribute to our vulnerability to developing a psychiatric illness, okay? So there's one type of genetic difference, which is essentially that you've got a missing chunk of DNA. It's very, very too small to be seen down a microscope, but there's a missing bit, or maybe an extra bit. Of genetic material. So we know that people with psychiatric disorders have missing or extra chunks of DNA, too small to be seen down a microscope, but they're there, okay? And we also know that there are tiny, tiny, tiny changes in the level of the DNA sequence. So just those letters of the genetic code that you might have seen about, like CAGT and all that. Sometimes you can have one of those letters that's changed for a different letter, and those seem to be able to increase our vulnerability to developing psychiatric illness. So just as a side note here, I think it's really important to just be aware that our capacity to identify the types of genetic variation that might contribute to a person's vulnerability are always driven by and limited by the technology that we have available. So as I said in the beginning, all we could do was look down a microscope at the chromosomes. Didn't give us very much. So now we've got technology that allows us to look at the DNA way more closely, and we've found some things that seem to contribute to a person's vulnerability. But there's probably all sorts of other stuff that we haven't even found out about yet. So it's still an area of very active research to try and understand all of the things that might increase a person's vulnerability at the genetic level. So just taking that further then, if we've got some of these genetic factors identified that might make a person more vulnerable, what do they do? So let's talk about that for a minute. How do these genetic factors contribute? Basically, we don't really know. We don't fully understand yet. But a couple of things to share with you. As we were talking about, right, genes are the special pieces of DNA that tell our bodies how to make proteins. And proteins include things like neurotransmitters or receptors for neurotransmitters. So we might imagine that perhaps genetic differences are one way in which chemical imbalances in the brain might occur. So I know that lots of you will have heard the message that mental illness arises as a result of a chemical imbalance in the brain. And what I've heard lots and lots of times over the years is people saying to me, okay, well, that's very nice, but how did the chemicals in my brain become imbalanced in the first place? And so essentially what I'm saying is that the saying that genetics plays a role is not in conflict with the chemical imbalance in the brain idea at all. In fact, it's one way, it represents one way in which chemicals in our brains might become imbalanced. So hopefully that makes some sort of sense. Okay, so what does all of this mean practically for me right now? Okay, a couple of very basic things. First of all, there is no genetic testing at this point in time with which to establish a psychiatric diagnosis, with which to confirm a psychiatric diagnosis, or with which to refine a psychiatric diagnosis. Okay, so all psychiatric diagnosis is still based on a detailed clinical interview with a skilled practitioner, basically. We're not yet at a point where genetic testing can help to inform that psychiatric diagnostic process. And so lots of the time people are interested in the concept of genetic testing because we like to imagine that maybe it will help inform us about what the chances are that we might develop mental illness ourselves. And in fact, at the moment, the best way to determine chances for other members of your family to develop a psychiatric condition themselves is by visiting with somebody like a genetic counsellor to look at a detailed 3-generation family history that focuses on psychiatric disorders. So that's really the best way that we have right now at this point in time for estimating what chances for other members of a family to develop a condition like mental illness. Okay. So I know we've talked about this already, but it's so important. I'm going to say it again. A couple of really important things to remember. It's not nature or nurture, or as we've been talking about it this evening, it's not genes or environment, or genes or experience. It's genes and our experiences, genes and our environment. Both are very, very important to the development of these conditions. So not caused either entirely by genes or by experience. We don't inherit vulnerability. We don't inherit mental illness itself. We inherit vulnerability to mental illness, and we don't have genetic testing to predict with certainty. So that's where we're at in terms of understanding the genetic contribution to these kinds of things. But let's take a moment and think a little bit about what the environmental or experiential factors might be that we know of that can contribute to somebody's vulnerability to developing one of these conditions. So what are the non-genetic factors that are involved? So we know that people who are later diagnosed with schizophrenia are more likely to have experienced a difficult birth. So the process during which they entered the world was complicated in some way. So really important point, obstetric complications do not cause schizophrenia or any other mental illness. This is a thing that can just increase vulnerability in a tiny way. Okay, important thing to know. Okay, another really interesting association that we've observed is that people who are born in the winter months might be more vulnerable to certain kinds of psychiatric disorders than those who are born in the summer months. And again, this does not mean that if you're born in the winter, then you're going to have a psychiatric illness. Of course not. But there is an association there. So it plays a small role. Okay. Things like immigration. Immigration is a thing that's been well studied. And there's been a number of potential explanations to explain why we see a higher rate of psychiatric illness amongst immigrants. And it doesn't seem to be limited to visible minorities or anything like that, this effect that we're talking about. So the explanation that seems to hold the most weight, if you like, at the moment is that when we immigrate, we actually, and speaking as an immigrant myself from Britain to Canada, you actually lose a lot of your social support network, and there's all sorts of interesting pressures to adopt or adapt to your new culture, and that can create all sorts of challenges. So it seems that these are the sorts of things that we're thinking might be underlying why we see an association between immigration and certain kinds of psychiatric illnesses. We also know, of course, that if you've experienced a psychiatric illness yourself, then for most of us, there's usually some kind of stressful life event that we can point to that happened around the time that symptoms were exacerbated, that we started feeling bad. There's not always something obvious that we can point to, and it's certainly not always trauma. It doesn't have to be to that level, but certain kinds of experiences that we as individuals experience as having been a stressful event. These are things that we think can contribute to the development of these conditions. And then there's also some really interesting and good studies coming out talking about the role of certain types of illicit drugs. So things like cannabis. There's some fairly good evidence now that smoking large amounts of cannabis, particularly in adolescence, can increase vulnerability to developing psychiatric illness. And again, so I don't want you to think it's causative. It's not, it's not necessarily on its own. It's not going to lead to the development of a psychiatric illness, but it's a thing that can contribute. And the same deal with things like crystal meth. So the crystal meth in particular can be related to psychosis as an experience. So that's sort of just giving you a broad overview about the types of genetic variations that we know about that can contribute to the development of these conditions, and the types of experiences that we know of as well that can contribute to the development of these conditions. And so we've talked about them both kind of separately, and I've said that they go together, but like how? So I'm just going to share with you a model that we've developed here that lots of people have told me over the years is really helpful for kind of conceptualizing how these things work together. I'm going to share with you in case share it with you in case it helps you too. So the concept here that we're going to be working with is that every single one of us has a mental illness jar, and that in order to be actively experiencing an episode of illness, your mental illness jar has to be filled all the way up to the top. Okay, and there's two different kinds of vulnerability factors, if you like, that you can use to fill your jar. In this model, we're showing genetic vulnerability factors are represented by these yellow circles, and our experiential or environmental vulnerability factors are represented by these orange triangles. So what can happen? So what we know is that we all start out with a certain amount of genetic vulnerability. Every single one of us, we all have some genetic vulnerability to mental illness. Okay, so how much genetic vulnerability we each have is going to vary between individuals. Some of us are going to have a lot, others of us are going to have a little. Most of us are going to be somewhere in the middle, frankly. Okay, but we all have some. And what we can see in this model is that the amount of that genetic vulnerability does not change over time. And that reflects what we know from research, okay? But what can change over time is how much environmental vulnerability there is in our jars. So again, represented by these orange triangles. So you've got a couple of examples here of things that we know about from the research literature that seem to be able to increase a person's vulnerability. So complicated birth, as we were discussing, that's a thing. That can increase a person's vulnerability, and things like head injuries as well. These are things that we think of as perhaps being able to contribute to a person's vulnerability. But even after those events, this person's jar is not full, okay? So then we might think of them as being more vulnerable, but the jar is not full. They're not actively experiencing an episode of illness. But let's take some more time, and let's say that over this period of time, the person that we're looking at, they start using street drugs. Let's say they start using crystal meth. Let's say that they leave home to, let's say, go to university for the first time, which is exciting, but also stressful. And let's say that as well, this person breaks up with their partner that they've had for a while. And together, all of those things create a set of events that adds enough of these environmental triangles into the jar that the jar fills all the way up to the top for the first time. And that person experiences their first active episode of mental illness. Okay, so that's how we think. So I know this is a very simple model, but it actually sort of we can use it to represent quite accurately some of the complex things that we understand that we understand from all of the research that's been done into the genetics of these conditions and how environment works into that and that sort of thing. So I know it looks simple, but it actually works quite well to describe these complex concepts. So that's how people get sick. But in the context of mental illness, we're in the lucky position that actually people can recover, and we can use the jar model to talk about that too. Okay, so in this picture, what we're starting out with is that at the beginning, the person's jar is full, so they're actively experiencing an episode of illness, and sometimes there may be some things that we might be able to do to remove some of these environmental vulnerability factors from our jar. So if crystal meth use was a thing, maybe, by stopping using crystal meth, we're immediately removing a couple of these, environmental vulnerability factors from the jar. If sometimes you may be in a position where if there's a particular stressor in your life, you may occasionally be in a position where you can remove yourself away from that stressor. Not always by any stretch of the imagination, but occasionally that's a thing. So maybe that's a way in which sometimes we can remove some of these environmental vulnerability factors too. But even better than that, there's actually a way of making your jar bigger, is the deal. So we talk about like protective factors, and what they're doing in this model here is they're rings, they're represented as rings, which are stacking on top of the jar, making it taller, essentially, so that the jar can accommodate more environmental vulnerability factors without getting full, which is kind of a nice idea. So for people who have lived experience of mental illness already, then a really useful protective factor can be medication. If you've got one that works well for you, great. That can be really good. But there's other stuff too. We have really good research evidence about the importance of sleep, nutrition, exercise, good social support networks. All of these things can function as protective factors. So stacking on top of your jar to make it taller so it can accommodate more of that environmental stuff without getting full. So that's kind of nice, really. So that's the concept that we use in psychiatric genetic counselling to help people understand what we know from research about how people get sick, but also how people can get better. And excuse me 1 second, I'm going to have to cough. Oh dear, sorry. Okay, so that's where we're at. So you may be wondering, okay, this all sounds very lovely. So what's the deal with psychiatric genetic counselling then? Okay, let's talk about that. So I think that the background, the basics that I've just given you is a really good starting point. But I don't want you to think for a second that that's it, okay? So a psychiatric genetic counsellor will be able to help you apply the things that we've talked about today, and apply them in the context of your own unique personal or family situation. So help you figure out what your own specific vulnerability factors may have been, and what sorts of protective factors you might be using. So, because it's not, but there are some protective factors that are good for everybody, as we've talked about: sleep, nutrition, exercise, good social support. Those are good for everyone. But there are other protective factors that work for some people and not others. And a genetic counsellor can help you figure out which ones of those might work for you. So an example I think might be helpful here. Okay, so I had people tell me for years and years that meditation was really helpful for protecting their mental health. So I thought, sounds good, I'm going to give that a try. So I signed up for my first meditation class, and I went, and it was one of these things where you're supposed to sit there and, soft focus with your eyes and, release all the thoughts from your brain and count your breath. And if you have a thought, no problem, just acknowledge the thought and begin counting your breath again from 1. So for me, I kept having thoughts over and over and over again, and I only counted number 2 in my breaths in the entire hour-long class, and that was only because I cheated. And so everybody else was sitting there looking all serene and peaceful, and I was in a state of abject panic because I couldn't make my brain do what it was supposed to be doing, and everybody else looked like they were having a great time. So all of this to say, meditation didn't work for me. Mindfulness, on the other hand, does. There are mindfulness practices that I adopt into my everyday that really do help my mental health. So a genetic counsellor can help you with those things, figure out what's going to work for you, what maybe not. Okay, so that's one thing. Figuring out what kinds of things you can do to protect your mental health, as we were just discussing. And understand the chances for others in your family to develop mental illness based on your family history. So those numbers we looked at the beginning, they don't apply to any individual, not one of you. Okay, so if this is something you're concerned about, go talk to a genetic counsellor, because we can take those numbers and we can personalise them based on all of the other things that you've got going on, to make them actually fit you, instead of not fitting you, which those ones I showed you don't, because they're general in population. Good. And most importantly, perhaps, I think the ways that genetic counsellors can help you is if you are feeling at all like guilty or worried or anxious or anything like that about what caused mental illness for you or for your loved one, then that's really a very, very important role, I think, for genetic counsellors, is helping people with those kinds of emotions. All right then, but you may be thinking, well, for those of you who may be listening this evening thinking, yeah, but okay, this doesn't apply to me because I got you covered. Let's see. So you may be thinking, well, but what if the mental illness in my family doesn't look genetic? What if I'm the only one in my family who ever experienced an episode of mental illness? What then? And I know that there was some really stressful life events going on for me just before my episode started. So it doesn't look genetic. We all have some genetic vulnerability to mental illness, every single one of us. Okay, this is a thing that we know from research. The genetic variations that can contribute to vulnerability are so common in the population that we all have some of them. Okay, so a genetic counsellor can help you with the things that we were just talking about, even if you think that your own experience with mental illness is that it doesn't look like there's a genetic contribution. All right, this isn't just a thing that's for people who have really strong family histories, is what I'm saying. You may say to me, okay, but I'm adopted. I don't know my family history. So what you going to do? And in this circumstances, a genetic counsellor can still help you how to figure out, how to protect your mental health and so on. So there's still potential benefit for you there. And they can still talk to you about what we do know if you're concerned about the chances for your children to develop something that you've experienced in the mental health spectrum. Okay. You're saying, what about if you say to me, okay, sounds great, but I don't want to see a genetic counselor because I'm not interested in genetic testing. Fine, no problem. You don't have to have genetic testing to have genetic counselling. And in fact, in the context of psychiatric disorders, there's rarely it's often the case that genetic testing isn't even indicated. It's not really a thing. So you don't have to be interested in genetic testing to go see a genetic counsellor and for it to be helpful. Okay. Okay, this is a really important one. Sometimes people are afraid that they don't want to go see a genetic counsellor because they're afraid of being told that you shouldn't have children. Okay, this is super, 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 super important. Genetic counsellors don't tell people whether or not they should have kids. This is such an important, big life decision, and it's very, very personal. As a genetic counsellor, I see my role as being to help you make sure you've got all of the information and support that you need to make a decision about this stuff that's in alignment with your values and your priorities and that sort of thing. So and so that is the genetic counsellor perspective to this kind of issue. Okay, so that's not something that you have to be concerned about in this context. Okay, so who are psychiatric genetic counsellors? Well, you can find us through looking at the About Genetic Counsellors website that I'm going to show you in a minute. And what you're looking at right here is a quote from a lady called Rena Varley, who actually received psychiatric genetic counselling from one of my colleagues in the clinic that we established here in Vancouver. And I love this quote from her. She says, "Because of genetic counselling, I've been able to release years of doubt and suspicion about why I am the way I am. I now own my entire life. I celebrate who I am fully with pure pride." It's lovely. I wish for that for everybody who lives with mental illness and their families. This matters so much to me because it's personal, as you've heard. You know, I have my own experiences with this stuff. So yeah. Anyway, if you want to read more about her experiences with genetic counselling to sort of figure out if it might be a thing for you, it's on our little blog there if you want to take a look at it. And you can find it on this page that I'm flashing up on your screen right now. And I think with that, what I might do is turn it over to Catherine, and we'll see if we've got any questions, because I wanted to make sure we've got time for discussion. Yeah. Hi, Catherine.
Wonderful. Hi, Janine. Thank you so much for the presentation. I learned a lot, and I really appreciate all the resources you're providing for our community. I want to just say hello again to everyone on the call, and thank you all for joining us to participate in this next focused part of our call. We have an open question and answer portion of the call. As a reminder, if you'd like to submit a question to Janine for us to address directly, you should see a question and answer tab on your screen if you're not seeing it. Hover your cursor over the Zoom dialog box that you were viewing tonight's presentation on. There should be a little section called Question and Answer Q&A. You can select that question and type a question aloud. We will work to read them. Janine, I don't currently have any in the queue right now, just to give you a heads up. So,
I did such a good job of answering all the questions as we went. That's why.
Oh, yes, exactly. That's what I was thinking. But if anyone has something, you can always email nsgc@nsgc.org, and we can make sure that that gets to Janine. I think Janine also had shared some of her information at the beginning of the presentation, but maybe Janine will just give a few more minutes. I want to make sure that there's no technical difficulties that we're having in order to get questions to you. I know that everyone joined us and their energy. I want to make sure that we get them to you if they had joined the call specifically to ask questions. So again, you should be able to see a question and answer portion in your dialog box with the Zoom technology. Just use that to submit a question our way. I don't have the ability tonight with our presentation to unmute your line, but if you type a question into that dialog box, I am happy to read that aloud directly to Janine. So just give it a few more minutes.
Okay. Yeah, so if anybody's on Twitter as well, I did share with you my Twitter handle. It's J9_Austin. And so if you have questions that you'd like to ask me offline out of this forum, I'm happy to take them via Twitter too.
Oh. Oh, Jean, we have one received. Was there any place
I can even see
online?
it here too. Yeah.
Okay.
Is there a place online to find jar model visual aids? So yeah, there is. If you are a genetic counsellor, if you're a genetic counsellor, you can find them on the NSGC website. They're available for all members to download for free, and you can use them with your patients and your clients that way. And then if you are somebody who lives with mental illness or a family member, then you can actually find the jar model online because of this talk. Yay! So it will actually be posted on YouTube on the NSGC channel after this session. So if you've got other people that are interested and you think that might be a helpful thing for them to look at, you can direct them to this video on NSGC's YouTube channel. Oh, I can see more questions. Catherine, can I ask it?
Yes, go for it.
Okay, how many sessions does a patient usually have with a psychiatric genetic counsellor? Okay, great question. So psychiatric genetic counselling is not usually like a long-term thing, all right? So it's not like having a therapist that you're going to see, sometimes for years. With psychiatric genetic counselling, it's a very sort of targeted set of discussions that you're having. So we can help with the emotional issues around guilt, shame, stigma, fear, blame, all of that stuff. But as it specifically relates to the explanations that we have for causes of illness. Okay, so what I found in our clinic, we wanted to make sure that we weren't shutting the door on people who wanted to come back in for more sessions. So what we've been doing in our clinic here is we have one session as standard with everybody that we see, and then we follow up with them 1 month later to have like a little follow-up to see how the information that we shared with them settled and if there's anything that they would like to come back in to talk about. And what we found is that actually very, very few people feel that they need to come back in. I think it's like less than 10% of people feel like there's more that they want to talk about after our first session with them. So this is that's a very long-winded answer, but the upshot is it's not usually a long-term relationship. But yeah, people usually find that the single session that we have is really, really helpful. Yeah. Great question. Hang on a second. Oh gosh. Okay. Here we go. And then a follow-up question to that was, do you often work closely with other mental health care providers to help families? Yes, absolutely. So a psychiatric genetic counsellor will always try to hook you up with other resources in your area. If that feels appropriate and if that's what you want. So if you want a longer term therapist or counsellor, the genetic counsellor will absolutely help connect you to those resources in your community. And oh my lordy, I can't keep up with all these questions. What happened? Oh gosh. Okay. And then the other part to this question was, do we follow families over time? And so I was just saying how usually there's a single session and then we do a follow-up with people to see if they want to come back in, and often people don't. However, we always make sure that people know that we have the door open so that, if life circumstances change, let's say we met you initially when you were single and you just wanted to talk about, why do I have mental illness when nobody else in my family does? And we talked about that and that was all good. But let's say now you've got a partner and you want to talk about what are the chances for my kids to develop the same thing I had, then absolutely, we'd love you to come back in and see us again as your life circumstances change, and we can help with those new things as they emerge. Yeah. Okay. Oh gosh, blah, blah, blah. I think I've gotten those ones. Open, okay. To know, okay. All right, so we've got a question here about protective factors. So somebody would like to understand what additional practices people can use to add rings to their jar. So I think, just again to reiterate, there's some of these protective factors that are going to be sort of fairly, they're going to be good for everyone, okay? And those things are going to be good quality regular sleep, good for everyone. Good quality regular meals, if we can, like nutrition stuff, that's really important too. Exercise, it doesn't have to be hardcore, little walking, that's all good, whatever you can do, these things are all helpful. And social support networks, so even just having one good friend that you can chat to about things that are important to you, these things are fairly universal in terms of being protective for our mental health. The other stuff is going to be more individual. So for some people, it's like our spiritual or religious communities can be super helpful, and the practices associated with that can be very protective of mental health. For other people, it's stuff that's as simple as like making time to have a long hot bath, spending time petting your animals, these kinds of things. It sounds trivial and stupid, but it's not. These can be really powerful for people. So I would suggest that have a chat with a genetic counselor. They can help you reflect and find out what some of the things might be for you, I suppose. Yeah. Oh, and then we've got a related question, I think. So what protective factors may be applicable for parents of children with 22q who worry about the development of psychiatric disorders? Is there anything specific that you've noticed to be helpful? And just for those of you that might not know about 22q, earlier on in the presentation, I was saying that researchers have identified that there are sometimes there are these missing or extra chunks of DNA that can make a person more vulnerable to developing a psychiatric illness. Well, 22q is one of those. There's a missing chunk of DNA on chromosome 22 that makes people more vulnerable to developing psychiatric illnesses. So that's the background context for the rest of you. And is there anything specific that we can do as parents in that context? And honestly, truly, really, the best of the knowledge that we have so far is that this is probably not going to be very satisfying, I'm afraid, but those same things that we've been talking about for the last couple of minutes look like they're going to be just as helpful in the context of 22q as they are in the context of psychiatric illness that's not related to that particular deletion. And we don't have, I wish I could say to you that we have a special medicine that we can use for people that have 22q that's protective. We don't have that, unfortunately. So those conversations about sleep, nutrition, exercise, good social support, and all of that stuff, can all be really good in the context of 22q as well. Let's see. Have we got another one, Catherine? I think, is this a new one here?
Yes, one more.
Okay. I know you said that there are limited types of genetic testing for mental illnesses, but can you talk about what types there are? Okay. So actually that's, the questions are coming in such a beautiful sequence. Thank you, everyone. So because actually one of the types of testing is for that condition that we were just talking about, 22q. It's not necessarily going to make sense for everybody, but sometimes a physician will think about ordering testing for 22q deletion syndrome if somebody has psychiatric illness and some other features that we might look for. So, medical conditions like a particular kind of heart defect, or particular kinds of problems with one's palate, or particular difficulties with learning. So if somebody has psychiatric problems plus a whole host of other medical issues, then that's often an indicator that physicians use to think about ordering genetic testing for that condition. Otherwise, different physicians will think about ordering different types of genetic testing, maybe. But at the moment, there are no clinical practice guidelines that say that we should test everybody with any psychiatric disorder for these conditions. I'm going to make the exception here of autism. Autism is a little bit different. It's actually a developmental disorder as well. and genetic testing gets applied very regularly in that context to help understand what's going on with autism. But with the things like depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, bipolar, OCD, eating disorders, ADHD, all of that stuff, there's no clinical practice guidelines at all saying that we should be doing genetic testing in those contexts. And actually, we often don't really know how to interpret them, okay? And the thing I want to bring you back to here is that what we know at the bottom is that there is no genetic test that we can use to establish, confirm, or refine a psychiatric diagnosis. And if you want to understand chance for developing an illness, then most of the time, the best way to do that is to visit with a genetic counselor and look at a detailed 3-generation family history. I know it sounds way less sexy than genetic testing, but it's actually really good. That's all my questions. Do you see any others, Catherine?
No, you've handled them. You've addressed them all. Thank you, Janine.
Cool. Love the questions. They were really good. Thank you, everyone.
So Janine, the only other follow-up that I had was to let everyone on the line again, thank you for joining us and being a part of the Genetic Counselor and New webinar series. And then I just wanted to let everyone know that I will work to take a recording of tonight's presentation. I know sometimes it's a lot of information to digest, and sometimes you think about different parts of it in the morning. So I will take a recording of our presentation and post it on the website that's displayed on the screen right now, our About Genetic Counselor.com website. So I will post that as soon as I can in the morning, so it will be available for you all, and that is some of the resources that Janine had mentioned earlier. You'll be able to view them in the presentation as well. So Janine, those are the only other housekeeping remarks that I had as the moderator. I would happily turn it over to you if you had anything else you wanted to say before we close out the presentation tonight.
Sure. Okay. I just want to say thank you again, as Catherine did to everybody. And if you took one thing away from this evening's presentation, I want it to be that it's not your fault. If you have mental illness, it's not your fault, and you're not doomed forever to be stuck in a bad place. Okay. So the good thing I think about genes and environment working together to contribute to the development of these things is that we can say with authority, not your fault, but there are things that we might be able to do to better protect our mental health going forward. So yeah, that's all I want to say. So thank you very much, everybody. It was lovely to virtually meet you. Bye.
Thanks. Good night, everyone.
Bye.